welcome to the not just the Boswell Book Company virtual event series, but the Boswell Book Festival virtual event series, coming to you live from both Scotland and London. I'm Daniel Golden from Boswell Book Company in Milwaukee, and one of the greatest things about us going virtual is this partnership that we have with this amazing world-class book festival, which we'll talk about in a moment. With that said, I would like to introduce Caroline Knox, the director of the Boswell Book Festival, who may be coming to us as an amazing, larger-than-life, spirited voice.
Yes, well, I think there must be censorship at work in Scotland today, because I've been blacked out, but you're not missing much, I can assure you. I think there couldn't be anything more appropriate than two organisations, the Boswell Book Festival in Auchinleck and the Boswell Book Festival in Milwaukee, both named in honour of the great biographer James Boswell, joining together on Boswell's actual birthday. So here's to Boswell, happy birthday, Bozzy. With a festival based in a former mining area, D.H. Lawrence's childhood has a particular resonance for our local audience, as we witness daily the legacy of heavy industry set within beautiful countryside. And with Robbie Burns as Boswell's contemporary and neighbour, it was so interesting to find reference in Francis's wonderful biography to the sense of brotherhood Lawrence felt with him. So thank you, Daniel, and the whole team at the Boswell Book Company. I'm only sorry you can't see that I don't have your T-shirt on, because I would love to have worn it. And thank you, Francis and Bill, so much for agreeing to do this conversation. I know it will be totally enthralling, and one that, were Boswell here too, he would have undoubtedly relished and would undoubtedly have recorded in his journal. So over to you both.
I have the honor of introducing today's author and conversation partner on day 4,593 of us being in business. I do want to mention that if you want more information on either of the Boswells, boswellbookfestival.co.uk is where you'll find more, and I'm hoping that I get to actually visit in person and bring one of our Boswell totes next year, or boswellbooks.com for Boswell's virtual event series. But much as nice as they all pale in comparison to today's event or this evening's event, depending on which side of the world you're watching it. We are so honored to be welcoming Francis Wilson, the author of Burning Man, The Trials of D.H. Lawrence. The book has been receiving wonderful reviews, including Francesca Wade in The Guardian, who wrote about this extraordinary biography. Wilson's narrative lays bare the fascinating struggle between Lawrence's two selves, one peaceful and spiritual, another which fantasizes about shooting everyone he sees with invisible arrows of death. Lawrence, Wilson writes, is a figure composed of mysteries rather than certainties in this astonishing tale, rife with jealousy, messianism, I don't have that pronunciation right, and blood. She meets Lawrence on his own terms, offering readers a mythology of his deeply wild and complex spirit. Francis Wilson is the author of several works of nonfiction, including The Ballad of Dorothy Wordsworth, which won the Rosemary Crochet Prize, How to Survive the Titanic, winner of the Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography, and Guilty Thing, A Life of Thomas de Quincey, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and received a fellowship from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center in 2018. Amazingly enough, Bill Goldstein is also a Cullman Center Fellow for 2019-2020. He is also the author of The World Broke in Two, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature, and a forthcoming biography of Larry Kramer. I am also one of his biggest fans. So with that said, may I present to you Francis Wilson and Bill Goldstein.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Francis, for being here. Daniel is one of my very oldest friends, and I am in New York, where Daniel grew up, and I grew up, and we met when we were both in college. So one of the great thrills of my life was when The World Broken Two was published, and I was able to speak at Boswell in Milwaukee, and Daniel interviewed me about the book. So
Wow.
that was a great highlight. So I'm happy to be back at Boswell in this new way, in this new era, and to be with Francis, whose book is so magnificent and so wonderful. And I just, and having written about Lawrence, I was, completely surprised by everything in it. I just gave me the sense of how inexhaustible a subject he is. But speaking of Boswell, the biographer, how inexhaustible almost any great subject is for biography, and how many biographies can and must be written, no matter how good or comprehensive or specific any earlier ones might have been. That there's always room for new insight and interpretation. New details emerge because the writer sees things in a different way. And so I guess it is wonderful to be here on Boswell's birthday and to recognize my own inadequacy as a biographer, both because Francis Wilson comes quickly after me to say all these new things about Lawrence, but also for us to know that no biographer can encompass his or her subject by themselves. And so I feel a kinship and total inferiority both to Francis Wilson and to Boswell himself. So I come to you as a supplicant in the subject of Lawrence. But let's begin with a few things about Lawrence, just to let everyone know what your book is about in being about Lawrence, because it's not just a life of Lawrence from birth to death, although we learn obviously about both his birth and his death. I want to talk about the specific things that you wanted to do in Burning Man. And so if you could tell us a bit about the time period in particular that you focus on, and the structure of your book, which does so much to shape what we learn about Lawrence. Your structure is a very important part of the subject matter of your book too. If you could speak to the things that interested you in Lawrence and how that shaped your book, literally shaped your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bill. Yes, so the structure of the book is the book. You're right, it is. I think this about books all the time, that books are a shape and should be looked at as a shape as much as a picture. I see Burning Man as a triptych. It's a triptych of, if you like, a triptych of biographical novellas organized around the great medieval poem, The Divine Comedy, and which sounds much more eccentric than it actually is, I think. I mean, the structure of the book evolved very organically. And it started off, the structure kind of fell in place because I started off writing just about Lawrence's middle years. I wanted to write about Lawrence between the ages of 30 and 40. So those are the years 1915, when The Rainbow was first published and banned and publicly burnt in the streets of Covent Garden in London, and end the book in 1925, when Lawrence is first told, although he should have known long before, that he has tuberculosis, and so he has his death sentence. So I wanted to write about these 10 fantastically hectic years in the middle of Lawrence's life. And obviously, if you're writing about someone lost in the middle of their lives, you are really in the territory of the Divine Comedy. And so it sort of, I began, if you like, in the middle of that image. And the reason I wanted to write about these middle years of Lawrence's life is because there have been, as you know, Bill, so many thorough and excellent lives of Lawrence. I mean, he's been so well documented. I don't think there's anything about Lawrence that we don't know now. I mean, all the facts are uncovered. I think we almost know what Lawrence was doing every single day of his life. And so there was nothing new for me to uncover. So in the same way that what you did so beautifully in The World Broke in Two was to weave Lawrence's story in with these other modernist lives. And what I tried to do was to take his story out and isolate it and just look in forensic detail at these 10 years. And I like going into great detail in things. And I thought if I focused on 10 years, I can get the microscope out.
Well, I love what you say about, the book is its shape, because that's very important in Lawrence, in understanding Lawrence too, I think. And you make that clear from the beginning and throughout, that Lawrence wrote in so many different, what we would call genres, but that there's such a continuity in all of his work, whether it's what we would call travel writing, obviously poetry, journalism, criticism, fiction, short stories, novels, biography, and that there's more in common that these have, rather than just, oh, well, he did all these things in all these different genres, that the shape of the book unites them. I mean, not literally that each has the same shape, but there are other ways of looking at continuities in a writer's work. And so the way in which Lawrence, the artist, did things in all of what we take to be different genres, but is doing a similar kind of work of the imagination in all of them. Can you speak to how that helped you understand a lot of what happens in Lawrence's life and in his writing? Because you do such a magnificent job, and we'll get to some specifics, of weaving in the work as redolent of the life and the life as it is subsumed in his work during these 10 years and throughout his whole career.
Thank you. Gosh, what a question. Okay, so I'll start off by addressing that whole question of genre, because it's so fascinating in Lawrence. As you say, I mean, he was a master of so many different forms of writing. But having said that, he only wrote about what it was like being Lawrence. Right. And so it doesn't matter if he's writing about a voyage to Sardinia, or he's writing about the apocalypse, or he's writing about syphilis in the 19th century. He was always writing about the experience of being D.H. Lawrence on the day that he was sitting writing about whatever it is he was meant to be writing about. And so there's something anti-generic, I think, in Lawrence's genre writing. I mean, his novels are like diaries, and his poems are like plays, and his plays are like short stories, and he uses genre to explode it in a way that I didn't really appreciate until I started to write Burning Man, because I saw Lawrence, as we all do who were kind of raised in the late 20th century, as essentially a novelist. And so I thought I'd be writing about D.H. Lawrence, novelist, as F.R. Leavis called his great and ultimately destructive book. And then realized, very, very quickly, of course, that D.H. Lawrence, novelist, was a tiny percentage of this enormous man, and it's not at all how he was seen in his lifetime. I mean, nobody talked about all the people who lived and worked around Lawrence didn't see him as just a novelist. They saw him as a man of letters, and it was anyone's guess what he was going to pull out of the hat next, what rabbit was going to come out of that hat, because the writing was so unpredictable. The essays were so unpredictable, the subjects were so unpredictable.
His journalism, I mean, it's what you say is it's astounding to go back to something you said before, which was about how much we know about Lawrence's day-to-day life, because in addition to all of this writing that he did that is actually published, he also wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of letters. I mean, that just document his every mood, just as you say. I mean, everything he writes, and then of course his letters, are about Lawrence. I mean, both of us, when in my book, and then in your book, we also write about his book Kangaroo in particular.
Yes.
And you have this wonderful phrase, I mean, that he basically writes a novel about a dream time in Australia while living through the dream time in Australia or something. You know, I may not have the exact quote, but it's that he's writing in real time what is happening, and he's both doing this in his letters and he's novelizing it, and then he comes to a stopping point, and then he writes in his letters about how he's come to the stopping point. So the chronicle never really ceases, even though it's moved from one form to the other. But you say about Lawrence and all of, I hate to use the word after we've said it's exactly incorrect, but in all these genres beyond novels, you approached the book, you say, beginning it, with about Lawrence the novelist. So can you say something about how you, as a biographer, have been surprised once you get underway, both with Lawrence and then with De Quincey or Dorothy Wordsworth or any of the other subjects you've written about, how what you are imagining or believing the book will be changes as you learn more about the subject that you thought you knew already?
Yes, yes. That's such an interesting question. I like writing about very difficult people, and I like writing about I like writing about people who write a lot but are very hard to read. And so this is something that Lawrence had in common with Thomas De Quincey, that you get lost inside him and you have no idea at any point who you're dealing with, because the character is so complicated. And what I set out to do with Lawrence, very naively, was to have a kind of straightforward argument with him, really. I thought, well, I'm a woman who was brought up in the kind of Kate Millett era of, Lawrence criticism. And I've never really been able to properly engage with Lawrence because the conversation has always had been completely shut down. I mean, Lawrence's name is a name that sort of triggers a psychological lockdown, really. And I felt, I couldn't read him at school because my teachers thought he was a dirty writer. I couldn't read him at home because my mother was a second generation feminist, and she thought he was anti-feminist, although she had, before Kate Millett, thought that Lawrence was a champion of women's orgasms in the 60s. And I couldn't study him at university because my female tutor was an anti-Levicite. She was a deconstructionist, and so she felt that Lawrence had been hijacked by Leavis. And so it rolled on that Lawrence, the door was shut all the way. So finally, when I got round to thinking about Lawrence, I had no idea, who I was going to find or what the conversation stroke argument would be about. And so I came to him in thinking it was going to be a certain kind of biography, and then instantly realized that I was up to my neck in complexity here, and that the only way I could write this book was by trying to see the world as Lawrence saw it. So I had to channel Lawrence. And the first thing that I kind of realized about how Lawrence saw the world was, it was a very, very strange way of seeing the world, is he thinks in symbols. He thought in symbols in a very, if you can say someone thinks in symbols in a literal way, Lawrence has thought in symbols in a literal way. I mean, he actually gave himself, as we all know, the symbol of a phoenix. Who does that? Who says, this is my symbol?
I thought that was so beautifully, not only the point you make is so important, but then you develop it so beautifully, and you make us see that he thought that way. I mean, you have this gift of allowing us to see the world through his eyes, not only through his words, but through your own imagination. And I want to come back to that word imagination in a little while, but you do begin to see that symbolical way in which he understands the world, and also how he sees himself as a symbol, which is both a kind of overwhelming egotism and also a great insecurity. I mean, and that he is a shaken, I don't want to say unhappy, but he's such a fragile person. I mean, physically, we know from tuberculosis or his thinness, but also as demanding and as intolerable as he is, and as intolerant as he is. It's all this fragility too. I mean, a kind of strength and fragility that it's almost like the fevered amount of writing he does is to make himself grounded and solid somehow. Yes. In a way that his own life, he doesn't feel that he is somehow. I may have gone on too long about that, but
that's beautifully put. And when you say that his writing grounded him, I mean, that's very literally the way he wrote was to sit on the ground. I mean, he took himself outside, sat on the ground, pulled up his knees, and wrote with his beautiful script on this yellow line paper against his leg. And I think it was very important to him that he wrote outside. And I think the reason there are so many reasons why Lawrence wrote outside, but one of them is I think he had terrible claustrophobia, and this became more and more apparent as I was trying to kind of get inside Lawrence like a method actor. I thought all of his rages take place inside the house. His arguments with Frida take place inside the house. When he's outside, he is a different person. I divided Lawrence into self one and self two. Yes. And self two, the person who is fully alive to the beauty of the world, the joyful, generous self who is, as Lawrence said, most of the time puzzled, was the outside self. And the ranting, inhuman herd self was the inside self. And I think that anyone whose father had been a coal miner would, of course, have a claustrophobic instinct, being trapped beneath the ceiling and between walls closing in. He often referred to the Edgar Allan Poe story about walls closing in. He often described that as his wartime experience. Anyone whose father had that job would feel claustrophobic. And so I think, yes, Lawrence needed to find a way out of a sense of being trapped in his writing. But sorry.
Oh, no, keep going, please.
All I was going to say was just when you were talking earlier about seeing the world through Lawrence's eyes. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Bill, that seeing the world through Lawrence's eyes is an astonishingly gratifying and beautiful thing to do? Because the way he sees the world, the natural world, is so astonishing. And I loved it. I thought that seeing the world through Lawrence's eyes would be something very different.
Well, I mean,
it might be almost an ugly experience.
It's so true. I mean, and I felt the same way when trying to figure him out. I mean, and of course, when you're writing about someone, as much as you know about them, you really are figuring them out as you write. I mean, and so as you revise, as you rethink, I mean, you come to a subject with some sense of the outlines of their life and even some of the major themes. But of course, it does change in the writing. And Lawrence is such an angry person so much of the time, and as you say, I mean, he became a violent husband because he had grown up in a violent family. I mean, there are things, and then about his attitudes, there are so many things that are deeply unpleasant. And yet the closer you see life through his eyes, which not only, as we've said, all his works really present the world that way, but as you begin to see the amount of things that he does, the number of things that he does, the decisions that he makes that he instantly regrets, or that he then does the exact opposite. I mean, you feel such sympathy for this person who has felt that it's necessary to be decisive, but then through so much of his life has to mold himself into and out of pretzels to make sense of something that he's just done because he's He's next doing the exact opposite. And, one
Yeah.
of the things that is a highlight of, his hegira around the world, that as you described in these years, is the way not only that he goes from place to place, but something that I had to deal with in The World Broken Too is, he wants to come to America. So he wants to go west, but what does he do? He goes east. I mean, he goes through Ceylon. So he, has a way around the world to come at it from the west when, there is just the more direct route would be, across the ocean, which he resists. And so he's, as he does in 1921, 1922, he makes a decision to do one thing and then he can't do it. And then he has to backtrack and write all of this rationalization. And so much of his consciousness, so much of his energy is taken up in rationalizing what he's done, that it's amazing he achieves as much as he did. Because I mean, if he's so much of an overthinker, and I think of my own overthinking as getting in my way, and yet it just led him further and further into himself and further around the world, and encompasses so much.
And what a contradiction, that this overthinker, this man who rationalizes every cup of tea he has, was someone who was anti-intellectual, anti-reason, and believed that the core of the self was located in the body, and that was his whole mission. So the biggest contradiction out of all Lawrence's contradiction was that he put all of his faith in the body that was failing him, and completely dismissed the authority or the power of the intellect that was so magnificent in him. And
that he almost feels is I don't want to use the word burden, but isn't the right way to approach the world. I mean, he's left to approach the world intellectually, and yet he doubts that so much that he comes up with an entirely new vision of the way in which we exist in the world.
I know. And it was so it's so bonkers, the vision. But I was struck by how much Lawrence actually flowed with rather than against the tide. That so many of his views, which seemed sort of completely idiosyncratic and ridiculous, like that the body is composed of magnets, and so he had to come to America from the Pacific rather than the Atlantic because his magnets are pulling him that way. That was just straightforward theosophical reasoning. And he thought in exactly the same way that Mabel Dodge Luhan thought, and exactly the same way as Madame Blavatsky thought, and yes thought. I mean, this was he was just very much part of the Edwardian New Age, and so his theory of the unconscious as being not something floating around in the mind, but something that was located very physically, like a kidney or the liver behind the solar plexus, was actually just part and parcel of the sort of the New York intellectual life at the time. East Village thinking.
I love the way you describe. I think it's that his understanding of anatomy did not coincide with the doctor's understanding of anatomy, and that was straight from Madame Blavatsky. I mean, that's just there's so many. I mean, one thing I just want to say to the audience is there are so many brilliant lines like that in Francis's book. I mean, so it's not only a beautiful and important book overall, but just on a sentence by sentence basis, there's a kind of stunning insight and a freedom of register where you are almost, if not directly addressing the reader, but where you do have almost something so casual presented that you really feel like, oh, that's Frances Wilson speaking directly to me about her ideas about Lawrence. And you don't do it in any kind of first person narrative principle in the book, including what you talk about. And let's talk about this now, the self one that you have identified, and then the self two. And if you could talk about how this double consciousness is both related to something that Lawrence says of himself. You quote him as saying, "I'm not one man, but two," but then also to his very important and often overlooked work, because people don't think of him always as writing criticism, the double consciousness of classic American literature that he found in classic American literature in this magnificent book, Studies in Classic American Literature. So can you just talk about the double consciousness and all the different ways in which it manifests itself in Lawrence's life, in Lawrence's personality, in his writing, and then how that helped you see through that in your, or see that through in your book?
Yes, right. So once I'd come to terms with the fact I was writing a biography of two Lawrences rather than one, I suddenly, I felt as if I knew what I was up to. And Lawrence, as you say, Lawrence described himself as kind of splitting in two, and he assumed that everyone was like this because he couldn't understand a world that wasn't exactly like him. And so he said, of course, we all have two selves. We all have the herd self who rants and raves and is unreasonable. And we all have this quiet kind of inward, pensive, most of the time puzzled self. And maybe we do all have that, but we don't have it to the extent that Lawrence had it. Now, Lawrence's first girlfriend, Jessie Chambers, located the exact moment that Lawrence split in two. And she said, until Lawrence was 19, he was one person, and that person was pure joy. He was more alive than anyone else in her family. You know, just being around him made you feel as if you were seeing the world in Technicolor rather than monochrome. And he made everything seem fun. He was an extraordinarily energizing presence. And she was in love with him. And she encouraged him to write. I mean, she was the one who kind of launched him as a writer. And then at 19, she said he snapped in two. And she locates this change. She said that, you know, you saw the joyful, blissful Lawrence very rarely. Otherwise, you saw the ranting and raving, angry Lawrence. And she said she locates that change around the moment when Lawrence's mother told him that he must either marry Jessie Chambers or drop her, at which point Lawrence went absolutely crazy and started to and realized that he couldn't marry her because, well, essentially he was married to his mother, but he couldn't marry her because he didn't sexually desire her. But he also couldn't marry someone he did sexually desire because the very fact of sexually desiring them meant that they were filthy. And so this split was organized around Lawrence's feelings about sex and sexuality, which were fantastically complicated. And the fact that we see Lawrence as a kind of priest of love who had something to tell us about sex. He had no idea what that thing was that he had to tell us because he was so confused about it. But so the split emerged, and we find that split all the time in the novels that in the later novels, well, starting with Women in Love. I think that's the first time we see the split, and that's every time Birkin comes onto the page, you think, oh no, the herd self is going to start ranting and raving, and the lovely, most of the time puzzled self is going to be shut up for a while. And so the novels start to be interrupted by the split, and then sometimes the split disappears completely. I think in Kangaroo the split's not really there very much. There's a more cohesion there. And when Lawrence was writing the first draft of Studies in Classic American Literature, which he wrote in Cornwall during the war, he wrote in Cornwall in 1915 and 1916, before he'd been to America and having read only just a handful of American books, he worked this sense of a split consciousness into his understanding of American literature by saying that American literature was itself born on a split consciousness, because there was this repressed, buried in these magnificent texts like Moby Dick, were presenting themselves as children's stories, but actually they had this unconscious buried underneath, which was ready to kind of burst through the surface. And it is electrifying as criticism. The fact that this was written when it was written by a fairly educated man who'd read a handful of books, but he was so in tune with the way that his own mind worked, and he was so ready to project his own consciousness onto the whole world that a stop clock is works, it tells the right time twice a day. And Lawrence was absolutely right, I think, in his analysis of American literature.
I love there's something that you remind me of in when I was working on my book and thinking about Lawrence. I decided that all of Lawrence's writing was a kind of science fiction, that it was a projection of what the world should be, ought to be, projecting out into the future of what it could be. I mean, every book of his, everything he writes is a kind of thought experiment in that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He was very interested in science fiction. He was very interested in what H.G. Wells was up to, and he wrote these fragments. If you sort of leaf through Phoenix 1 and 2, which are the collected miscellanea of Lawrence, there are a number of fragments of stories which are science fiction, where he does project himself into a future where people are wandering around in white robes and whatever. And he was a time traveler. I mean, he traveled back in time and forward in time. So for a modernist, he was very restless.
You brought up, I want to talk, first of all, when you say he was a modernist, I love the phrase that you use in the book, a modernist only by mistiming. Because of course he is a modernist, but not always in the ways that people think of modernism. Forster, I mean, with whom Lawrence had a complicated relationship, I think also was a modernist in his way by mistiming. And people can forget, I think one of the things about Lawrence's novels anyway, aside, if you leave aside their subject matter, really, Lawrence was not an inventor of novelistic structure. I mean, he does modern and innovative things with the novel, but he's not interested in finding new structures to reflect consciousness, which I think is what sort of the modernist project is in its largest, most simplified way. Is like, how can we reflect? How can we show the workings of the mind on the page, and what new innovations, how can we structure things differently? How can we reflect the curlicues of individual consciousness on the page? I mean, I think that's something Woolf, Joyce, as different as all these writers are, they're trying to do that. Lawrence was not trying to do that in a non-traditional way. And so I'd like you to talk, following up on that, on Lawrence as a modernist, but also if you can say something, now of course I lost track of the other point I was going to make. I mean, talk about, there was something you said about Lawrence and science, going to ask you to follow up on because it relates to your book, but talk about Lawrence as a modernist and modernist by mistiming, and then hopefully I will be able to come back. Sure. Yeah. My other key point, which was obviously so vital to the conversation.
So it's Lawrence as a modernist is such a complicated thing, because Lawrence was very, very at odds with his own time. He was at war with his own time. He longed to be in the Middle Ages. He thought that we should all live like medieval people, which is again why I think the Dante motif comes up so frequently in his work, because this was a golden time for him, when he felt that mankind wasn't kind of disturbed. Men weren't disturbed by their intellects. They lived, and it was very naive and very Laurentian. They lived in their sturdy bodies. They lived close to the land. And so this is what he wanted for modern contemporary life, to get back to the basics of a kind of mindlessness, if you like. So on the one hand, Lawrence would weep for longing for the Middle Ages. He'd look out of windows in Italy and see in that view, across fields and mountains, a view that Dante saw, and the tears would come down, roll down his cheeks, and he'd say, I can't go into the future. I can't live in the present. I can't go into the future. I have to go back. I have to go back. And then he'd wrestle with that and say, no, I must go forward. I must go forward. And then he would write in his poetry, because he loved Whitman. He loved Whitman and saw Whitman as the great modernist poet. He would talk about Whitman's poetry as flying into the future, because he'd loosened the poetic line. And then he was really excited by the future and really excited by the moment. And he talked about Whitman's poetry as being alive in the moment, like a lily forcing itself up out of the water and living intensively and then going down again. He said, this is what we want in poetry. And so in terms of his poetry, he was magnificently modern, and perhaps more modern in as much as he wanted to capture the moment than any of his contemporaries. But the Lawrence the poet bears very little relation to Lawrence in any of the other genres, except perhaps in Kangaroo, which is about the moment. And it is extraordinary, isn't it, Bill, the way in which he was writing Kangaroo in the year that Ulysses came out, without having read Ulysses. Right. And so much of Kangaroo is playing, like with newspaper excerpts, is playing with what Joyce would play with. So Lawrence believed that people were in tune through invisible electrical wires. And in a sense, he was.
Well, I also remembered the other point I wanted to make, so I'll come back, because you said about time travel, and I'll come to that again. But the thing about Ulysses, I mean, you make that wonderful point about the similarities, I mean, between some chapter, a particular chapter in Kangaroo and a particular episode in Ulysses. And Lawrence didn't read Ulysses until well after he had finished Kangaroo later that year, and didn't really like it. I mean, he didn't like it at all and was very impatient with it. What I thought was also so interesting, I mean, again, we both were writing about Kangaroo and yet had different things to say about it. I was struck in reading Kangaroo how similar a particular chapter is, when Lawrence is dealing with his own experience of World War I, and the novel is set in the present of 1922, his time in Australia, but to understand how he got to 1922 and got to Australia, he and then the main character who's based on him have to go back to his experience in World War I mean, in England first. And what I thought was so interesting about that was the way in which that is happening to the character while he's walking through the streets, or that's the prelude to that chapter. And it's exactly what is happening in Mrs. Dalloway, in the story, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street, and then in the novel, Mrs. Dalloway, that Virginia Woolf is writing at that exact same moment, and to approach the same understanding of what happened in the war that got us to this place. And so the coincidence of that, you don't want to say technique, but the coincidence of that provocation and the way in which, in their different ways, they try to solve it by the same method of understanding the past. I mean, using walking through the street as with writers who were, more at odds with one another than Woolf and Joyce, and Woolf and Lawrence and Joyce, and yet those similarities are so that way. But what I wanted to remember is, you were talking about time travel, and here you're talking about Lawrence and wanting really to live in the Middle Ages. I mean, which I think is both an earlier part of an earlier time in a distorted world that may be getting back to something purer, but also I can be looked at as a kind of moralism. I mean, but you talk about Lawrence as a time traveler, but also his, and I used this word before, his hegira around the world, that it's not just geographic in terms of one place to another, but in a Dantean way, it's moving from an underworld to an empyrean. And if you could talk about Lawrence's, again, that kind of double consciousness, but the way in which he moves through time and place, traveling in time, and then this geographic journey of altitudinous. I mean, like moving from lower to higher. You make that point so beautifully as an important structure in his life.
It was yes. Now, if you map Lawrence's travels on if you get out a world map and get a marker pen and draw Lawrence's travels, it looks like a bowl of spaghetti. It looks completely irrational. Why is he going there and then there and then there? It doesn't make any sense at all, which is strange for Lawrence because everything is organized. Lawrence thought symbolically, he thought very structurally, and he saw himself as someone whose life had a purpose because he was a Christ figure, because he was a divine figure, because he had a purpose. He knew that his life was going to be shorter than other people's. But if you track Lawrence's journey kind of in terms of vertically rather than horizontally, you see that it goes straight up. That he was born in the underworld because his father, not only was his father a miner, but everyone in the whole of Lawrence's town every man was a miner. The only men he'd ever met who weren't miners were the priest and his school teacher. And so all the men in Eastwood, where Lawrence grew up, went underground during the day. And he talked about this inferno life led by the fathers. And Lawrence was, as soon as he became conscious, I mean, he was someone who knew a huge amount about the Bible. He knew the Bible off by heart, and he knew his Dante off by heart, because in the late 19th century, everyone knew the Bible and Dante off by heart. And so Lawrence was very aware of the world as a kind of structure of kind of hell and heaven. Lawrence's ashes are apparently daubed into the cement of the Lawrence Memorial Chapel in the Rocky Mountains in Taos County, 8,000 feet above sea level. And so we can see his trajectory from Inferno to Empyrean. It's going like that. And Lawrence always talked about America as paradise. That was what he called America. America was simply paradise, period. That was it. You went there because he saw himself as a pilgrim going to America, but also as Dante's pilgrim, trying to find clean air, a land that was completely unpopulated, that was pure, that was close to God, which was all sun. And what he loved about New Mexico was that it was all sun and all sky, which is exactly kind of Dante's description of the Empyrean, was this incredible kind of this light, this celestial light everywhere. But Lawrence was also disturbed by New Mexico, the atmosphere of New Mexico, because he said there is no atmosphere. There is no atmosphere, which is exactly what Dante says about the Empyrean. Of course, Dante misses hugely the underworld, where he can throw all his friends and he can enjoy the kind of the drama of punishing people, which is what Lawrence loved doing best. Nothing happens once you get through the Inferno and Purgatory and you're in paradise. Nothing happens. The story is over. There is only your eternity, if you like, but death, if you like, as well, to face. And so his paradise was a very frightening and disappointing experience for him. But I also noted when I was following Lawrence around the world that he chose houses again and again and again. He chose houses that were on ledges. And if you remember from the Divine Comedy, it's all organized around ledges. There are all these 9 ledges in hell, and there are all these ledges in paradise, and the ledges in purgatory, and the ledges end when you get to the Empyrean. Lawrence always lived at the edge of a cliff. His house was always falling off a cliff into the sea. So, and he could have lived anywhere, but he chose these houses that were kind of pivoting on edges, and he always gravitated to the heights. So when he was in Capri, for example, I knew going around Capri which floor Lawrence would be on. I thought, of course, it's going to be on the top floor with the view. When you go to Sicily, you think, of course, it's going to be that house falling into the sea on the cliffside. Of course, it is. And so he either consciously or unconsciously kind of found himself these extraordinary places to live. But it was also, I think, his rise, his sense of his life as a vertical rise was, I mean, it was symbolic in one sense, but it was also to do with having tuberculosis.
Right.
You know, that he was looking for his magic mountain. He was trying to breathe, and like all consumptives, he was charging around the world looking for clean air. All consumptives sat in sanatoriums on the top of mountains.
I love what you're saying. I mean, the geographic consciousness and unconsciousness of these choices that are not choices in another way. And I just remember from doing my own research about Australia is, you know, the house that he ended up living in with Frida in Australia is on the edge of the Pacific, and I mean, hanging over the cliff. I mean, and you know, and how noisy the ocean could be, even though, you know, they love.
And it came into the house.
But what was amazing to me was, you know, the accident of that was that it was not desirable to live along the cliff there, and that was the cheap house that they could find, or the less expensive house. So partly need, but then the fulfillment of these of Lawrence's goals and needs and desires in all of these accidental ways that then, you know, become part of that Lawrentian purpose and, you know, inevitability that we feel when we are reading him and following along in his life, that as much as he is going in 20 directions at once, or going in the wrong direction and then going this way, that there is a kind of inevitability of beauty and introspection and failed introspection that all lead to something purposeful in his life. And before, you know, we're going to go to questions in a minute. There are a couple, but I wanted to just ask you if you could talk about one of the most marvelous, long and stunning interludes in your book. I mean, it's a biography of Lawrence, but partly because of what he is doing in roughly 1920, 1921, 1922, we get this fantastic interlude of the biography of an important Maurice Magnus. Wonderful time on this unknown person. I mean, who obviously, you know, was known to Lawrence, but why it was so important, and it is a successful digression. I mean, I love digressions that have so much purpose. But tell us a little bit about this central part of your book and how this biography of this other person is so important to your conception of Lawrence and to your conception of Lawrence's biography.
Yes. Okay. So one of the least known pieces of writing by Lawrence is called The Memoir of Maurice Magnus, and it's very rarely been republished since it first appeared in 1924. And I think it's one of the most brilliant pieces of writing that Lawrence ever did, because it shows us a completely different side of Lawrence. Now, The Memoir of Maurice Magnus was written by Lawrence to be a preface to a memoir by Maurice Magnus of his own experience of being a homosexual in the French Foreign Legion. And Lawrence wrote the memoir to help promote Magnus's book after Magnus had committed suicide. And Lawrence was not unimplicated in that suicide, because he was very close to Magnus during the time that Magnus killed himself. And so you'd have thought that the memoir of Maurus Magnus would be a piece of loving, it would be loving, and it would be recollecting, you know, this man who is tragic figure who found his life unlivable. But in fact, it's a pure piece of Laurentian kind of magnificently, it's magnificent chaos, if you like, that Lawrence loves Magnus and he hates Magnus. And in fact, he's demolishing Magnus, but he's also praising Magnus. But the story he tells in the memoir is, I think, absolutely gripping, and it's about emerging out of lockdown, out of the lockdown of the First World War, coming to Florence in 1919 and meeting Magnus on the streets of Florence, just where Dante met Beatrice.
Yes,
and they have this kind of romantic friendship. And Lawrence is, of course, fantastically complicated about his feelings towards homosexuality. He's obsessed with homosexuality, obsessed with it, and also terrified of it. And here's Magnus, who's incredibly camp. And he describes his campness as with great humor. It says he walks in lots of little steps, and he has lots of perfume bottles on his dressing table. And he gives us a picture of Magnus that is so vivid. And then he describes a psychological codependence that develops between the two men. You know, but you realize that Lawrence is much more dependent on Magnus than Magnus is on Lawrence. Magnus funds money from Lawrence all the time, but he doesn't need Lawrence in the way that Lawrence needs Magnus. So there's this kind of, so the balance has shifted, because normally, you know, Lawrence is the one who discards people, but this time he's being continually discarded by Magnus, and they have this very intense experience together in the Abbey of Monte Cassino, which I describe as kind of the mountain of purgatory. So they go up to the Abbey of Monte Cassino together and have a series. And Lawrence has a series of epiphanies, which are very, very moving and change the direction of his life and the direction of his writing. And they're bound up with these very strong feelings he has towards Magnus, which are then exorcised in this kind of audacious and in many ways completely unacceptable memoir he writes of Magnus, which then created a literary furore. People said, you know, when Lawrence's memoir came out, people said, it's brilliant, but was it worth it? Is art worth it to be when you are that cruel? And I have to say, I think it is worth it.
And I guess I have so many more things I want to ask you. I mean, one of the things, I mean, speaking of art as cruelty, I mean, I think even some people who Lawrence was so cruel about in his fiction, I mean, parodying them, lampooning his friends, I think over time, some of them came to feel that they had been used to good purpose. I mean, either as resentful as they were. I mean, I think that to have been material for him was at first hurtful, but then maybe because he died young and they felt, you know, it just over time, it seemed that a number of people felt somewhat differently. I think
being parodied, being painted by Picasso with two noses.
Yes, I mean, Adeline Morel, I think, felt that way. Adeline Morel, I think, felt that way eventually. But I guess let me ask the question, one of the questions from the audience, and if we have time, we can come back. Because one thing I want to quote before I ask this question is you, and I hope we've made clear in our conversation that you talk about your book in the introduction to it, that it's a work of nonfiction, but in a Laurentian way. You don't make that claim, but I am making that claim for you, that it's a work of nonfiction, which is also a work of imagination. And I hope we've made clear to the audience how grounded in fact your biography is, but how imaginative it is, both in structure and in scope, and in understand that other biographers have not necessarily looked at, and that the imagination you bring to it is so wonderful and vital and beautiful.
Thank you.
So So I hope you feel that you fulfilled your goal with this book. I certainly feel that you did.
Well, I do now.
Well, thanks. One question from the audience is, how did Northern England shape Lawrence's writing?
Oh, so much. You see, Lawrence felt that he never ever got the landscape of the Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire hills out of his system. And even when he returned to the Midlands in the last years of his life, he was very, very moved by it and said, you know, of course, I never left. And he would describe the view from the roof in the house that he lived in as a child as like a view from Florence or something. He said, this is the landscape of my heart. And so he traveled around the world. He ran around the world. He ran up the world, but he was actually completely rooted in this strange industrial earth that he grew out of. And of course, that what I mean by that as well is that he was rooted in his class and in his people. One thing we haven't had time to talk about is how Lawrence's whole life was a life lived amongst the upper classes when he was working class. What was that like?
You quote this a wonderful description of him by David Garnett that, you know, encompasses some of that, those contradictions. I mean, the contradictions in Lawrence, but also in particular that are related to class.
Yes, he said that Lawrence was like a mongrel in a crowd of Pomeranians and Alsatians. You can imagine how T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf must have snorted with derision at him, because they'd never spoken to a working class man who wasn't their servant in their lives.
Right. No, it's true. And, you know, they did have disdain. I mean, one thing, just speaking of Eliot, I was astounded. It was such a wonderful accounting when we talked about Lawrence as a modernist, that he was featured in so many issues. I mean, I can't remember the exact number that you point out of The Dial, certainly the most established American modernist magazine, journal, and which was where The Wasteland is published and Ezra Pound's cantos are published and other important things. But Lawrence as this regular presence, far more than T.S. Eliot was ever published in The Dial. I mean, and so that just says so much, I mean, about the literature of the time, about Lawrence's position, and also to be how at odds that is with what you're saying about, you know, the social class from which he came and even the education that he had had.
Well, one of the reasons I think he gravitated so powerfully to America was the classlessness he felt existed there, that he was standing shoulder to shoulder with other writers rather than kind of looking up.
Right. And his and being with other artists, yet not with the kind of artist that Mabel Dodge Lewin, you know, necessarily was drawn to. I mean, I love everything about Lawrence is that he loves the world. He's, as a novelist, as a poet, as a critic, obsessed with human life, and yet he can rarely abide any individual real people. I mean,
I know, another contradiction.
Yes, another contradiction. Well, I think, I mean, we've gone over our time a little bit. I just wanted to say that Lawrence is inescapable, and that one of the oddities, which of course I hadn't planned on, is that the book I'm working on now, playwright, AIDS activist, but his first substantial work and his major early success was adapting Women in Love as a movie. And he produced the 1969 movie Bates, Oliver Reed, Jenny Linden, and he also wrote the screenplay for it and was nominated for an Oscar for it. So, so here, as attenuated a connection as it is, it's still central. So, you know, moving from 1922 to Larry Kramer, Lawrence is coming with me.
All those connections, all those wires still connecting. That's terrific.
And you talk about the homosexuality, his obsession with homosexuality and the centrality, of course, in Women in Love of that wrestling scene, which in 1969, when the movie is released, is about the most sexually explicit, scene in a mainstream movie. And of course, the movie seems really not to be about women in love. It really seems to be about men in love.
Yeah, of course it is.
So anyway, well, thank you, Frances Wilson. Thank you, Daniel Golden at Boswell Book Company. Thank you, Caroline Knox and at Boswell Festival. Thank you, James Boswell, for shining down on us on this.
Happy birthday, Boswell.
Happy birthday, Boswell. And Frances, I hope we will meet each other at some sort of Cullman Center reunion very soon.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who joined us both on YouTube and through Zoom. Hope to see you at another virtual event or at another festival. And now we all know the connection between Larry Kramer and D.H. Lawrence. So
yes,
your work all makes sense now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.